Welcome to Social Work Updates. In this video, we are going to talk about the introduction of social workers to psychology. In this opening chapter there is an introduction to the discipline of psychology and discussion of how psychology can be applied to social work. Each school of psychology has a different understanding of what constitutes the self. This understanding is explained, analyzed, and critically appraised within the chapter. After watching this video, you should be able to identify what the term psychology means, analyze some of the ways that psychology can be used by social workers, and critically appraise some of the ways that psychology can be applied to social work. It can be argued that psychology may be visualized as an academic ship of fools. Like the famous Hieronymus Bosch painting, the subject is similar to a boat that is at times unsure of its direction, with competing views on which course ought to be followed. This video explores some of the influential perspectives that have influenced psychology and ultimately shaped its form as an academic discipline. Before we look at the main psychological perspectives and discuss how social workers can apply psychological ideas, it is important to begin at the beginning and identify what is meant by the term psychology. Psychology is not as simplistic to define as it might initially appear. It is more than just a word. To a layperson, an immediate reaction may be to associate psychology with reading people's minds or analyzing aspects of human behavior. A dictionary definition of psychology may give a precise explanation, but this precision can disguise the complexity of the subject. An example dictionary definition is that psychology can be understood as being the scientific study of all forms of human and animal behavior. If we develop this initial understanding of what psychology is, we can assert that psychologists are not mind readers and they do not necessarily have access to our thoughts. They do not work solely with people who are mentally ill or people who are emotionally disturbed. These are common delusions and misinterpretations of the discipline. To go back to the beginning, the word psychology is derived from two Greek words, psyche, or mind, and logos, or study. This means that psychology literally translates as the study of the mind. Malim and Birch, 1998, claim that the discipline began in 1879 when Wilhelm Wundt opened the first psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany. Wundt focused upon introspection, or observing and analyzing the structure of conscious mental processes. It was the emphasis placed upon measurement and control that marked the separation of psychology from its parent discipline, philosophy. It can be argued that by 1920 the usefulness of this method was questioned. John B. Watson was one of a number of theorists who believed that it was wrong to focus upon introspection because this approach to studying psychology cannot be measured. Consequently, Watson dedicated himself to the study of what has become known as behaviorism, or what is measurable and observable. Behaviorism remained the dominant force in psychology over the next 30 years, especially in the USA. The emphasis was placed upon identifying the external factors that produce learning or conditioning, the stimuli producing responses. As with many philosophical and sociological perspectives, psychology is characterized by competing paradigms or models of thought, with theorists becoming grouped together according to which perspective they are representing. Malim and Birch, 1998, argue that an interesting reaction to behaviorism came in the form of the Gestalt school of psychology. Emerging in Austria and Germany in the 1920s and popularized by Fritz Perls. This branch of psychology suggests that the whole is greater than its parts and that this in turn complicates a focus upon the external factors producing thoughts. In other words, there is no one psychological perspective that holds all the answers in relation to defining the discipline. A further criticism of behaviorism developed through the 20th century as a result of the legacy of Sigmund Freud, who has become possibly the most famous psychologist. Freud proposed that the mind is a combination of conscious and unconscious thoughts. If this is the case, the theory can be used to challenge behaviorism because it means that human thought and behavior is more complex than the behaviorist notion that external variables create thought and behavior. If, for example, we do not know why we have dreams, how can we make a simplistic claim that they have been produced by external variables? Alongside this influential psychological perspective, there emerged a further significant theory that placed its emphasis upon thinking processes or cognition, in other words, the ways in which we attain, retain, and regain information. Within this perspective, it is what happens after a stimulus but before a response that becomes the main psychological focus. The mind is seen as being like an information processor, almost akin to a computer. Malim and Birch, 1998, explain this perspective by arguing that human beings are seen as information processors who absorb information from the outside world, code and interpret it, store and retrieve it. This could lead back to the initial criticism of introspection being unlikely to explain the complexity of human thought, so it could be argued that things come back full circle in a literal revolution of thought. This point is reinforced by some of the current developments within psychology. The scientific advances of the 1990s and beyond in relation to identifying the genetic and hormonal composition of the human mind have generated enormous interest in the idea that thoughts and behavior are determined by our biology. Once again, it can be suggested that this is a reductionist argument. It reduces complex thoughts and behavior to a few variables such as hormones and genes. It may prove to be yet another passing paradigm contributing to the discipline of psychology that will be criticized and revised with the benefit of academic analysis. From this initial debate about what is meant by the word psychology, we can ask a further question in relation to the nature of the human mind. Is the human mind the same as the human brain? We can now look at exploring some of these understandings of psychology. This is a way of adding detail to our introductory explanations of what the subject is. It is a means of setting the scene before we analyze how psychology can be applied to social work. The slides provides a summary of 5 major schools of psychology together with a brief description of their key features. This initial table is then developed to identify some critical features of each of the psychological perspectives in relation to key terminology and influential psychologists. These schools of thought are especially important because of the influence they have had in shaping the academic concerns of psychology. Their origins go back to some of the earliest philosophical ideas to have influenced Western thought. It may be suggested that the proposition that there are forces beyond the individual that shape social reality goes back to the ideas of the Greek philosopher Plato. This idea is central to behaviorism, so it can be proposed that the perspective has its intellectual origins in this classical thought. It may also be proposed that the notion that individuals interpret their social world as opposed to being ultimately shaped by this world goes back to the ideas of Aristotle. This philosophy is of central importance to humanism. In other words, the genesis of the perspective's dominant idea can be traced back to these early times. After discussing the different school of psychology, lets us understand the critical appraisal of how psychological therapies can be used by social workers. There is no single perspective that holds all the answers to solving the complex problems faced by many service users needing social work care. Human beings are complex, and although they have needs which are shared in common with others, the interpretation of needs can be particular to the individual. This means that the psychological therapies that have been outlined have limited application. the behaviorist therapies that have been summarized can make the mistake of focusing upon external variables to such an extent that the particular needs of individuals are not met. Every human being does not react in the same way to an external response. Even complex mammals such as dolphins can defy the laws of operant conditioning by doing the opposite to what they are expected to do. This means that there can be no scientific certainty of the therapies that are informed by this perspective. There is a further difficulty with behaviorist therapies that may be summarized as being linked to the unique nature of the human mind. There are profound ethical difficulties with therapies such as token economy. If a social worker were to put older service users on a token economy program, it could be claimed that the dignity and human rights of the individuals are not being respected. A token economy program is essentially saying, do this for me and you will be rewarded. This is a power relationship, and it could be argued that the individual is being manipulated in a hierarchical, non-egalitarian way. This means that there are critiques of behaviorist therapies and concerns that they have limited application to social care. It leads Malim and Birch, 1998, to criticize behaviorist therapies because they can be mechanistic and that they overlook the realm of consciousness and subjective experience. It can also be proposed that there are limitations in the application of Roach-Ryan client-centered therapy. For the service user to accept the importance of resolving the would/should dilemma, it is important that they share values similar to those of the therapist. The service user needs to accept that the values of the therapist are important so that there can be a situation where there is a link between what both therapist and service user want to achieve. There are, however, many instances when the values of the service user are opposed to the values of the therapist. This can be exemplified within a school environment in which the pupils do not want to achieve what their teachers perceive as being important. This is supported by research that has been completed on the Chava subculture within the northeast of England. It is also acknowledged by Anne Watson, 2004, in her discussion of the failings of the 14 to 19 curriculum within the UK. Watson argues that it is not so much that the curriculum is a bad idea, it is more that there is little awareness of how to unite the values of the pupils and their teachers. This can mean that if a social worker is to attempt using the ideas of Rogers, the therapy cannot work because there is no common understanding of what is important and achievable. It is all very well to say that a would/should dilemma should be resolved, but a service user can only be directed to their inner beautiful self if they perceive that self through a shared sense of identity with their therapist. This can mean that if a social worker is to attempt using the ideas of Rogers, the therapy cannot work because there is no common understanding of what is important and achievable. It is all very well to say that a would/should dilemma should be resolved, but a service user can only be directed to their inner beautiful self if they perceive that self through a shared sense of identity with their therapist. It may be argued that psychodynamic therapy has as many limitations as uses. The model is not based upon a sound methodology, and many of the theoretical ideas can be challenged. It is a theory that is built upon assumptions of how the mind operates. If this is the case, it can be argued that any successes within psychodynamic theory are due to good fortune as much as anything else. A more significant critique of psychodynamic therapy from a social work perspective is that it is a theory that is laden with negative value assumptions. The therapist is perceived to be in control of interpreting the service user's problems. The classic image of the psychiatric couch can be applied to psychodynamic theory. This means that there is no equality of dialogue. As opposed to influencing the therapeutic process, the service user is effectively disempowered by a therapist who tells what should be done in order to resolve fixated behavior. Malim and Birch, 1998, reinforce this criticism by emphasizing that within psychoanalytical therapies there are problems of validation. It may be suggested that within psychodynamic therapy the truth is invented as opposed to being truth in itself. The cognitive psychology of Jean Piaget can also be criticized. It is a theory that may have been mistranslated and turned into an unworkable model of the mind. Can it be accepted that the human brain moves through the stages that have become accepted as integral to Piaget's model? If not, and if thoughts develop through more of a process than a movement through distinct stages of development, it means that the potential application of cognitive therapy is called into question. A further criticism is that although one can take apart a computer and identify the microchips making up its component parts, the human brain is altogether more complex. All sorts of factors that are not necessarily conscious inform cognitive processes. This may mean that a perspective that focuses upon what happens after a stimulus but before a response is dealing with part of the picture, but not the whole picture of human thought. A further criticism of cognitive therapy is that the service user's problem behaviors or thoughts are always changed to those that the therapist sees as being acceptable. Malim and Birch, 1998, question whether it can always be the case that the therapist has the correct perspective on the world and that the service user's cognitive outlook is in need of total change. The biological therapies that are available to social work may be criticized because of what we do not know as opposed to what we do know. There is still much work that needs to be done in order to understand the hormonal and genetic composition of the brain. There is also a degree of uncertainty as to why some chemical treatments work with some service users and yet the same treatments are less effective with other individuals who have the same symptoms. This anxiety can be combined with the concern existing over the side effects of drug-based therapy and the ethical implications this has for service users. Taking a particular pill might make someone less aggressive, but if the consequences are the docility exemplified in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it may be argued that this effectively reduces the individual's life chances. There is also the critique that biological psychology is reductionist. It reduces the complex functioning of the brain to the relationship existing between genes, chromosomes, and hormones. By concentrating the focus on this single area, it can be argued that there is a possibility that other variables influencing human thought and behavior are overlooked. And that's it, thanks for watching. For more social work updates, please watch and like the video, hit the bell and subscribe to my YouTube channel.